Yeah, so we can get started. Thanks for being here. So today we have with us Rachel Hyneman, who joined the University of Arizona as an assistant professor with the Atlas Group in the fall of 2024. Prior to that, she was a postdoctoral research as a researcher with SLAC National Accelerator Laboratory in Menlo Park. She earned her PhD with the University of Michigan in the Atlas Group under Professor Tom Schwartz in 2020. And before that, she received her bachelor's in physics from the College of William and Mary in Virginia. And then outside of physics, she enjoys skiing and playing the double bass. So with that, I leave it.
Great. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I'm really excited to talk to you today and share a bit about the research that I've been doing, both at Arizona as well as quite a bit prior to that as well. So, oh, I keep forgetting this is not tuned in, so I've got to tap. Okay. So I want to start by giving a bit of an introduction to the motivation of why we care about Higgs boson self-interactions. So sorry, I should have actually given the title. Today I'm going to be talking about studying Higgs boson self-interactions at the Atlas experiment. So back to these Higgs boson self-interactions, we have to start to understand these at our standard model. And our standard model, of course, is our best theoretical understanding of the physics at the small scales of our universe. It gives us a structure of fundamental particles, our fermions, as well as our bosons. And it also gives us, of course, some form of interaction or recipe for how these particles interact with each other. These particles we can arrange in cute little diagrams like this. And then as far as this our interactions, we describe these with our so-called standard model Lagrangian. And if we play some very aggressive shorthand, then we can fit that Lagrangian onto this cute single coffee cup that you can buy from the CERN gift shop. Although apparently this now costs $35, and I think that's a lot of money. But I guess it does contain, the physics of our entire universe, so maybe that's a fair price. But of course, the standard model doesn't answer all of our questions, and it leaves us with some really big remaining questions. So just for our example, we know that we live in a matter-dominated universe. I am not really at risk of, annihilating into energy with some antimatter version of myself. And there is, of course, some asymmetry between matter and antimatter in the standard model, but not enough to explain the level that we see in our universe. We also have very good evidence from cosmology of this mysterious dark matter that seems to be interacting gravitationally with other stuff in our universe, but there's no dark matter particle that you could see in the standard model. We don't understand how this fits within this broader standard model picture. Additionally, there's a question of is our universe stable, or at some point in the future of our universe, is there a risk that the physics of our universe might suddenly and quite catastrophically change? But it turns out that the Higgs boson, the center of the standard model picture and our most recently discovered fundamental particle, could hold the key towards answering some of these big questions. And to understand that, we need to look at the so-called Higgs potential. That's just given by the very last term in our standard model Lagrangian. And in the very early universe, this potential shape was, we believe, somewhat like this U shape that I've drawn here with these dashed lines. And we know that our universe likes to be in the lowest energy state. So we want to be at the minimum of this potential right here in the very symmetric center. However, at some point, sort of early in the life of our universe, as it cooled and expanded, the shape of that potential changed to this W shape that's given by this equation over here, this simple squared plus quartic equation. And this or potential shape is quite famous. We sometimes call it the Mexican hat or wine bottle potential because it looks very nicely like the bottom of a wine bottle. And if you fall asleep after this, just remember that that little center part is called the punt, and it's designed to filter sediments out of wine. But back to physics. After we have this sort of change or relaxation of our potential shape, we can realize that we now have some lower energy state available. And again, our universe, being the lazy universe as it is, wants to go into that new lower energy state. So our universe will undergo a phase transition, and our Higgs field sort of basically just rolls down the hill into this new vacuum state, where we can see that our field is effectively on everywhere in space rather than being off at zero. During this phase transition, So after this phase transition in our new vacuum state, we can rewrite our potential with that new equation that you see up in the top right. Here we're just expanding about this new minimum. And I'll get back to that equation later. You also might notice that now we've sort of chosen an asymmetric position to live within this potential shape. And so you'll often hear this referred to as electroweak symmetry breaking. But the exact shape of this potential is something that theoretically we could wiggle around with quite a bit, and experimentally we have only extremely loose constraints on that shape. And so it's worth asking a question of what if that potential looks a little bit different than this wine bottle? So I'm going to give some broad examples of new alterations or new shapes we could give to this potential and their implications for new physics. So let's start with one given by this blue shape, where here I've added in to our center a little bit of a local minimum for our field to live in initially. What that would mean is that we would still want to move to a lower energy state, but this would have been essentially quantum tunneling through this potential barrier rather than a smooth transition of sort of rolling down a hill. And that's what we would call a strongly first order phase transition. And that means it would have been a sort of sudden and catastrophic phase transition in our universe. And this style of transition is actually required for something that we call electroweak baryogenesis, which means that this phase transition would have been the source of the matter-antimatter asymmetry, something called one of the Sakharov conditions, if you're familiar with those. Otherwise, essentially what's happening is that this process would have happened at some random point in the universe, and that would create basically an expanding bubble of new physics, and along the wall of the bubble, you can encode this asymmetry. We could also, instead of add a local minimum, add some additional global minimum. And what that means is that there's a lower energy state out there compared to our vacuum that we're living in now. And that's a little disturbing because what it means is that at some point, we'll probably tunnel through this other potential barrier, and the physics of our universe is going to suddenly and extremely catastrophically change. And we probably won't see this coming because this change will probably happen at the speed of light or sort of propagate through the universe at the speed of light. And we basically will just stop existing. And that's not really a super fun thought, especially if we look for some results from our theorist colleagues that show that we might actually be favored to be in this so-called metastable configuration. But don't stress too much. This is probably not going to happen tomorrow. So it hasn't happened in roughly 14 billion years. So you're probably going to be okay. But still, experimentally, we would like to know a little bit more about if this is really the case or not. Additionally, if we have any of these new shapes or really any other new shapes this potential, we have to introduce some new physics and some new interactions with the standard model. And those could, for example, come from some particle, some heavy new particle that would interact with the Higgs and could be a dark matter mediator, meaning that it could basically interact with the Higgs to link our own standard model with this mysterious dark sector that right now we otherwise don't know much about. So hopefully these examples have given you some motivation of why studying the exact shape of this potential is physically really interesting. So now that we know that we should look at this, how do we actually do it? How do we measure the shape of that potential? So let's go back to this equation that I wrote up a few slides ago after we've gone through this electroweak phase transition and we've sort of expanded about the vacuum that we're currently living in. Now that equation has a cubic term and a quartic term with this Higgs field. And what that tells us through quantum field theory is that we expect a 3 Higgs interaction and a 4 Higgs interaction in the standard model. And for the 3 Higgs interaction, we can indeed look for an interaction like this, and I'll get to that in a bit. For the 4 Higgs interaction, things are a little more complicated. We could look for this 1 to 3 Higgs splitting, with that first one being off shell. Unfortunately, if we try and do that, we could only constrain this coupling to about an order of magnitude, but that would be if we had a 100 TeV Hadron Collider, which of course is quite a bit more powerful than the current LHC. At the LHC, we really just don't have enough energy to actually directly probe this interaction. So that's a bit sad, but not all hope is lost. We could still at least look for some sort of effectively second order correction to this process, such as, for example, looking at this VV-HH interaction. So here we have an interaction between two vector bosons, W or Z bosons, and 2 Higgs bosons. And we can see that at least at one loop level, we have a contribution from this 4 Higgs interaction. So if we can't study this process, we at least do have some, although indirect, sensitivity to any new physics that might be hiding in that quantum interaction. So now that we know what interactions we want to target, what processes at the LHC actually include those interactions? And the answer is Higgs boson pair production, what we also sometimes call di-Higgs production. Same thing. All that means is that in these interactions, we're going to make 2 Higgs bosons instead of 1. And there's a number of different ways that we can do this at the LHC. The most common way by far is the so-called gluon-gluon fusion or GGF production. And our second most common method, about an order of magnitude rarer or lower cross section, is this vector boson fusion or VBF production. For GGF production, we have 2 diagrams at leading order that we really creatively call the box and the triangle. And we can see that in the triangle diagram, we very nicely have this 3 Higgs interaction at that little pink dot. In VBF, we have 3 diagrams at leading order, at tree level, and we again have this 3 Higgs interaction. We also now have this VVHH interaction. So if we study these processes and how often they occur, it gives us some clue towards these interactions. Now, I'll also note that I've labeled these with these kappas. This is just going to be how I'm going to present the results today in the so-called kappa framework. It's relatively simple. All I'm going to do is divide the coupling value by the standard model prediction. So if kappa is 1, the coupling is 1. Kappa 2b refers to the VBHH interaction, and kappa lambda refers to the 3 Higgs interaction. Now, this all sounds great in theory, but in practice, it's pretty challenging because di-Higgs production is a factor of about 1,000 times rarer than single Higgs production. And single Higgs production is already a pretty rare process at the LHC. Part of that's due to the fact that we have basically amplitude level interference happening between these 2 diagrams in GGF. And in VBF production, we actually have a direct cancellation between the middle and the right-hand diagrams. So this lowers our overall rate of these processes happening. But that carries with it some interesting implications for possible new physics if we want to change any of these interactions. So let's go ahead and start on the left. Here we're just going to focus on GGF production. What's shown is basically the sort of cross-section or rate as a function of MHH. This is just the invariant mass of those 2 Higgs bosons. And it's kind of a proxy for the energy of the overall system. Now, the color coding here tells you what are basically if your contributions coming from either the triangle diagram or the box diagram. And what we can see is if we end up changing kappa lambda, then we're disrupting that quantum interference that I mentioned in the last slide. And so we're going to get an overall higher rate. But because here we can see that that triangle diagram, if we have a lot more of it, it's in this sort of lower MHH region, then we're going to get a lot of softer events. So overall, more signal, but typically a little bit softer, lower MHH. For VBF production, here I'm showing something very similar. So again, in the x-axis, we're looking at the invariant mass of the di-Higgs system, MHH. But now what's shown here is explicitly the shapes that you would see in the standard model in dark blue. And then these different colors are all some explicit different choices of kappa 2b. And these are all normalized to the same area. So what we can see is that for any non-1 or non-standard model kappa 2b, these distributions all shift to the right. So if we have new physics in kappa 2b, we're going to break the cancellation between those 2 diagrams I mentioned in the last slide. So we expect a lot more signal. And we also expect it to be an average harder or more energetic in this higher MHH region. And these are going to have some interesting consequences for our sensitivity to different types of new physics that I'll talk about later. So now I'm going to shift gears and cover a little bit the Atlas detector and how we use it to measure Higgs boson self-interactions. Before I get too into the details, I want to give a bit of an overview of the timeline of the LHC. Also, is there a way I can actually turn off this? Do that. There. Okay. So I want to give a reminder of the timeline of the LHC to sort of put these results I'm going to be talking about in context. So during run one, this was our initial run. Here we discovered the Higgs boson. The data that I'm going to talk about today all comes from run two. And this was taken between 2015 and 2018. I'll note that we're taking more data as part of run three now. And then later in the talk, I'll talk and touch a little bit upon our prospects for these measurements in the future during the so-called HLHC or high luminosity LHC era. So the LHC is a circular particle accelerator. It's the most powerful one that we have in the world, and we mostly use it to collide protons. During the run two data that I'm going to focus on today, we're colliding them at a center of mass energy of 13 TeV, and we're colliding proton bunches roughly every 25 nanoseconds. We have 4 main experiments on the LHC, and I'm going to talk today about ATLAS, which I believe pretty much everyone in this room works on and is quite familiar with. And of course, we can see over here a rendering of the ATLAS detector, and I do want to point out our cute little people for scale. So just in case anyone here doesn't have a background in ATLAS, I want to quickly cover roughly how the ATLAS detector works. I see at least one nod, so I'm definitely glad I included this one. So if you look at this rendering, the ATLAS detector is kind of can-shaped, so our proton beams kind of coming through like this. And it's basically a sort of can-shaped onion where we have different layers going from sort of the proton beam outwards. So let's go ahead and take an azimuthal slice, which is shown by this pie here. Just to make sure everyone's oriented, our proton beams going in and out of the page. So when we create new particles from the energy in those proton collisions, they're going to basically go from inside to outside. And on this diagram, that means bottom to top, encountering the different layers in that order. So the first layer they're going to hit is our inner detector, which contains our tracking system. Here we record the tracks of charged particles. Further out, we have our electromagnetic calorimeter. Here we cause something called electromagnetic showering from photons, electrons, and positrons, and they'll deposit their energy within that system, and we can measure that deposited energy. Further out, we have our hadronic calorimeter. Here we also induce showers, but here hadronic showers from hadrons, and that means things like protons and neutrons, for example. Furthest out, we have our so-called muon spectrometer. Here we record the tracks of muons, which are a sort of heavier version of the electron that is unstable, but it's long-lived enough that if it's traveling at roughly the speed of light, it decays after it leaves our detector volume. We can essentially look at the combinations of these different signatures that we have and put them together to see what we're actually seeing as far as what particles are there and created in those collisions. We also have a very large magnetic field applied over the volume of this detector. And what that does is it bends the tracks of charged particles, giving us a handle in both their charge and their momentum, and another way to try and sort of put these pieces together in this puzzle to identify what particles we created in these collisions. So I'll also note that I said that we're colliding these proton bunches roughly every 25 nanoseconds. That means that we expect to see about 40 million events per second. And that's a crazy amount of collisions, which is good if you want to create these really rare processes like 2 Higgs bosons. A lot of that data, though, is essentially sort of glancing proton interactions that don't contain really the interesting new physics we're trying to target. And also, even if we wanted to store all that data, we just do not have the technology to both read it off the detector and store it. So we have a series of on-the-fly decision-making algorithms, both in hardware and in software, and we call this our trigger. And this makes a decision as to whether we're going to go ahead and record that data and save it for final analysis. And we do that at a rate of about 1,000 events per second being stored for this full analysis. There's one more signature that's really critical to this talk that wasn't on that last slide, which is something called a jet. So jets arise from the fact that the strong force is a little bit funky, kind of behaves like a spring. And what that means is I'm not allowed to have just a single strongly charged particle like a single quark hanging out in my universe. So if I create a high energy quark in my proton collisions, then it's going to go ahead and radiate lots of gluons, these strong force carriers, will create sort of extra quark anti-quark pairs, and these are going to form bound states to sort of shield that spring-like strong force. And this process basically that I've kind of cartoonized over here happens over and over very rapidly, basically instantly after we create this high energy quark. So what happens in my detector is I'm going to see this collimated stream of high energy particles originating from that quark. In the tracking system, you can see we have a lot of dense tracks close together. And then we also have very large energy deposits in that same area from both our calorimeters. Importantly, it turns out that not all jets are quite the same. In particular, jets that come from b-quarks, a somewhat heavy quark, are actually pretty special. So when that b-quark sort of starts this process of forming these bound states, it initially forms a b-hadron that's kind of stable and has a pretty long lifetime, at least by particle physicist standards. It'll live for about 1.5 picoseconds and travel about a millimeter away from that initial proton-proton interaction point before it then decays into that further stream of collimated high energy particles. So if we look for a jet that comes from a b-quark and we look at the tracks in that jet, they're going to point back to some vertex that's some distance away from that primary vertex where the protons collided. And we often just refer to this as a secondary vertex. And this is in contrast with jets coming from light quarks, like up and down quarks. All those tracks are just going to point basically right back to that proton collision. And we can use this information really effectively in order to try and identify specifically jets from b-quarks. We can feed the information of these tracks, the secondary vertices, and sort of basically how far away these tracks point from the primary vertex into some algorithm that utilizes some amount of machine learning. Just for the reference, for those who are a little bit more involved in Atlas, for the results I'll talk about today, we're using DL1R. And out from that algorithm will come something that we call b-tagging score. And this is just a number that represents our confidence that this jet came from a b-quark or not. And we can put some sort of selection or requirement to that score, and then we can reject over 99% of this light jet background if we're trying to identify specifically b jets. So now I want to put all this together and talk about a specific measurement studying these Higgs self-interactions, the so-called Atlas di-Higgs to 4b analysis. So if we want to study these di-Higgs events, we need to remember that Higgs bosons, they decay instantly. We don't see them going through our detector, but instead we see what they decay to. So if I have two Higgs bosons, I can make a cute chart like this that just shows the decay option of each of our two Higgs bosons. And then the number in color shows you basically how likely that decay is to occur out of these different combinations, which are kind of the most likely ones. Although I'll note that there's actually quite a lot of options, but most of them are really, really rare. And so I said that this is a really rare process, creating Higgs boson pairs. So it seems like we want to go up in this axis because we want to get one with the highest branching ratio because this gives us the most signal. Unfortunately, the story is not quite that simple. It turns out that as we go up in this axis, we get more signal, but we also have a more complicated analysis based on the fact that our backgrounds are actually much harder to deal with as we basically go up this axis. So more events, but easier analysis. And this is a trade-off that we respond to by just doing a bunch of different analyses to try and take advantages of the different, these trade-offs essentially. But I'm going to focus today entirely on this 4b final state. And here, it turns out that, again, even though we have a lot of signal, this is actually an especially challenging place for us to try and study Higgs pairs. So I want to give you some numbers to sort of show you why this is so challenging. So what we're doing is if we're looking for two Higgs bosons that each decay to a pair of b-quarks, so we're expecting to get 4 jets in total, then if we just look for events with 4 jets, we're going to see about 500 Higgs pair to 4b events. And that's a respectable number. About 20 of them are from the VBF process. Unfortunately, we have a huge amount of background, about 10 to the 8th events with 4 jets. So just other physics processes that, again, give us that same 4-jet signature. And that means that our signal to background ratio is about 1 in a million. And that's not so great because it's kind of impossible for us to make a really good statistical statement in our universe on 1 event in a million. And this picture was thought to be so bad for a long time that we can find some very nice quotes like this from our theorist colleagues, stating that the small signal cross-section combined with the huge QCD4b background make it essentially impossible to determine the Higgs boson self-coupling in pp to 4b. So essentially they thought this was an impossible analysis. But hopefully over the next few slides, I'll show you that it's not exactly impossible. We can start by being a bit smarter by, of course, using that B tagging. So instead of requiring 4 jets, we'll require 4 B tagged jets. And we can also require some specific kinematics of those jets that I'm not going to go into too much detail on because they're not particularly complex. Things like, for example, we expect that sort of these pairs of jets are going to be sort of close together angularly. And we can use that information to get rid of a little bit more background. Also, specifically for the VBF process, here you can see that we have these additional quarks in our diagrams. And that means that we're expecting 2 additional jets in the VBF events that are not B tagged. And I'll note that those have some also very peculiar kinematics, and they tend to be sort of very back to back. And we can also use that to our advantage. And so after we apply this analysis selection, we end up getting about 30 Higgs pair to 4b events compared to about 10,000 background. For the VBF process, we expect about a third of an event, but now only compared to about 350 background events. And so here our signal to background ratio now for both of these is roughly 1 in 1,000. And so this isn't, super high, but I want to emphasize that we've improved by about 3 orders of magnitude. I think that's pretty good. Unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. Or so actually, wait, one of those selections that we use is this kinematic selection related to the masses of basically our reconstructed Higgs bosons. So if I have 4 B tag jets, then I can pair them in order to create 2 Higgs boson candidates. And then I can make a plane like this that shows the mass of each of these 2 candidates. And this is shown such that the one with higher transverse momentum is on the x-axis. Now I know that my Higgs boson has a mass of 125 GeV. So for my signal, the invariant mass of each of these 2 Higgs candidates should be pretty close to 125, 125. And that's given by these dashed lines. And what's shown here is indeed actually for the signal process from simulation. And we can see that, again, it is peaked quite nicely. So I'm going to use that information. And one of these selections I'm going to apply is creating the so-called signal region that basically encapsulates where my signal lives. And I want to emphasize that outside of that region, we're going to have essentially entirely backgrounds. So I already talked about how that background is really large, but that's not really the end of the story. We have an additional challenge that it turns out it's really hard to accurately simulate these QCD events with lots of jets and especially lots of B jets. We can see that over here, we're going to compare this MHH variable. In black is our data, and then the yellow and blue are from our simulation, with the yellow being this QCD multi-jet background, most of what we expect. And I want to emphasize that this comparison is done outside of that signal region, so we are comparing here backgrounds to backgrounds. So any deviation that you see here is not from the presence of the signal. And you can see that here, these deviations get pretty big in the order of 50%. And this means that the simulation is not really accurate enough for us to do this analysis. We need some alternative approach, and we're going to choose to use some data-driven approach instead. So now I'm going to talk about that background modeling strategy, and it's going to utilize these max planes that I talked about. So we know that our signal is expected to have 4 B tag jets, but it turns out that the background processes that give us 4 B tag jets are pretty similar to the background processes giving us 2 B tag jets plus 2 non-tagged jets. So can we use this 2B data to try and estimate the backgrounds in this 4B region? So let's go ahead and compare. We're again going to do a comparison in these upper and lower wedges. These are control region. The reason we're doing it here is because we expect no signal. This is just a backgrounds to backgrounds, apples to apples comparison. So again, let's look at this MHH variable and invariant mass of the Dyson system. In black is the 4B again, and in yellow, now this is the 2B. And you can see these agree a little better. Now we're looking at about a 30% or so agreement. but still not quite good enough. So we still need some sort of correction factor. And one way that we could derive this correction factor is with what we call a reweighting. We basically take more 2B events in regions where we sort of see a deficit of 2B compared to 4B, and then sort of downweight the ones where we see more 2B compared to the 4B. And that reweighting we could derive from just the bottom panel. Basically, every 2B event, I multiply by the factor that you see down here. And by construction, if I do that, these two histograms are going to agree perfectly. That would work, but it's a little bit limited. If I want to do that, this is essentially a one-dimensional density ratio. So I'm taking the probability or distribution of the 4B over the 2B. But what I'm doing here is, one, I'm doing this in a binned way. So I'm comparing a histogram, so I'm binning the data. And that means that I'm prone to statistical fluctuations in bins where I have few events. You can even see this really happening at the edges here. These kind of just look like statistical wiggles. Also, this is only using one variable, this MHH, and that means that it's ignoring correlations with other kinematic variables that might be a little bit different as we move between regions on this mass plane. So if we derive that here, we might be ignoring some fundamental difference between this region and the signal region that we're trying to target in the end. It turns out we can be a bit smarter though, and instead train a neural network to actually approximate a higher dimensional event level reweighting. So by higher dimensional, we can use more kinematic variables than MHH, and event level meaning that we don't actually have to bin the data to derive this reweighting. And so I want to talk a little bit about what's going on here and how we use a neural network to do that and why it makes sense that we can. So normally I think of neural networks as being really good at classification. I would give it some list of input features like the kinematics of the jets in the event. I would pass it to the network and it would tell me an output of is 2B or is 4B. Similar to how I could give it lots of images of cats and dogs and then ask it to tell me which is a cat and which is a dog. But that's a classification. What we really want is a reweighting. But it turns out that when we're doing classification, the neural network is identifying the most differentiating features. In the cat and dog analogy, it might identify the size of the differentiating feature, and really big animals are likely to be dogs, and small ones could be dogs or cats. This is analogous to asking what features do very 4B-like events have. And it turns out that we could actually basically do exactly this reweighting and extract that information directly by just using a special form of the loss function. I can talk about that in a bit more detail if anyone's curious. But again, going back to the cats and dogs example, what we're essentially doing is asking the neural network if we want to something that's modeled like cats, then we'll give it dogs and we'll basically toss out the really big dogs and keep the sort of cat-like dogs, like maybe the chihuahuas that are kind of cat size and I don't know, have some cat-like ears or something. And so that's basically what we're doing, where we're just kind of keeping the most 4B-like 2B data. So now that we have this strategy, we have our neural network. We're going to train it again in these upper regions, the CR1. And we can go ahead and look at the agreement over here. So this is again MHH. The 4B is exactly the same as it was a few slides ago. But now the 2B is reweighted based on that neural network reweighting. So every event gets a small weight. And we can see the agreement between these two now is actually really good. So we can use the strategy to move forward with our analysis. Now that we have the neural network, we can go ahead and just apply it in this 2B region to try and extract the weight or our backgrounds in this 4B region. I put this chart up here that I should have explained earlier, apologies. This is basically just showing that what we're doing is sort of a glorified ABCD method, where we sort of training in this axis and then applying in this axis. I'll also note that you might have noticed that we have these left and right segments that I haven't talked about so far. Here we're using these are our CR2, and they're basically being used for validation and to derive some systematic uncertainties. So now that we have the strategy, we can go ahead and look into our signal region. I'll note that we do categorize or cut up our signal region into a couple of different categories. I'm only going to focus now on one that's specifically targeting the VDF process. But the others have basically similar levels of agreement. So in black, this is our 4B data, but now in the signal region. And in yellow is this neural network weighted background estimate. And we can see that these agree pretty well within statistical fluctuations, which is cool because it means that our background estimation at least seems to be working nicely. But it also means that we don't see any obvious signs of new physics or any obvious Higgs pair signal. These solid lines show you for reference what those different types of signal would look like. In pink is the standard model. In blue is if you change the 3 Higgs interaction. And in gray is if you change the VDHH interaction. And I'll note that this is a rare process, so all of these are scaled up a fair amount, meaning that if we see something consistent with our background estimation, this could be consistent with any of those scenarios roughly. So, okay, we didn't discover any new physics, but we can still make some interesting statements about our universe and constrain the living space of possible new physics. So these plots are very often shown in Atlas, but they're a little bit complex if you haven't seen them before. So I'll go through what's going on here. Let's first start by just constraining the 3 Higgs interaction, this kappa lambda. Now what's shown in the y-axis here is the cross-section, or basically rate at which we see this di-Higgs process. And the x-axis here is the value of kappa lambda. Again, 1 is the standard model. In black, this is our observed upper limit on that cross-section, so exclude everything above. What we want to compare it to is this pink line, which is the theoretical prediction of the cross-section. I want to note that this is not flat because, as I mentioned many slides ago, if we change kappa lambda and introduce new physics, we disrupt that quantum interference between the two diagrams, and so we expect more signal far away from the standard model. That's why it has this roughly V shape. So if I compare these two, anywhere where the theoretical prediction of the cross-section is above my constraint or my upper limit, this is an excluded value of kappa lambda. So I can look at the crossing points, and that gives me my allowed region, and that's roughly -4 to 11. So I'm sensitive now to basically order 10 deviations in this variable. What that means is I'm ruling out new physics that predicts a deviation more than that away from the standard model. I also want to point out another interesting feature of this plot, which is this dip that you see here. So the lower our limit in the cross-section, the better, the more sensitive we are. And you can see that we're best close to the standard model. And that also goes back to something I said many slides ago. If we have new physics in kappa lambda, then we expect overall softer or lower MHH events. However, this di-Higgs to 4B analysis is actually most sensitive in the high MHH region, or more sensitive to more energetic events. And so if we get new physics, then it's basically moving it to our less sensitive region. And so we're best close to the standard model and not so good as we go farther away. Hopefully that follows. We can play the same game for kappa 2B. Again, here we want to compare where our red, the theoretical prediction of the cross-section, is above the black line, our observed upper limit. And these crossing points give us an allowed region of about 0 to 2. And that tells us that here we're ruling out new physics that predicts an order 1 or more deviation to that VDHH interaction. Again, this cross-section is not flat as a function of kappa 2B because, again, we're basically disrupting this sort of amplitude level cancellation. So that's why, again, we get more signal if we go away from the standard model. But also note that we have basically an inverted shape here compared to in GGF, or sorry, compared to kappa lambda. So here, for this kappa 2B variable, if we end up changing that say if we change that variable, we end up getting more energetic or higher MHH signal, and that's the region we're more sensitive to. So for this analysis, we're more sensitive or with a lower limit for the beyond standard model, the new physics case, and we're sort of weakest close to the standard model where we have the softest signal. So I want to put these results in context. So I'm showing here is our combination between, in blue, this 4B analysis I just talked about, and then in green and purple, respectively, are the BB tau tau and BB gamma gamma analyses. And these are other mainline Atlas analyses looking for the same process. So this plot has a lot of lines in it, but it's basically showing the same thing as before. The x-axis here is kappa lambda. And let's just focus on the solid colored lines. Just note that the black one is the combination of all three. So if we look near the standard model, all of these solid lines are pretty similar. So here we have sort of comparative sensitivity to the other mainline channels, looking for the standard model GGF process, or sorry, for the standard model Higgs process. However, if we change kappa lambda again, then we end up with softer signal, and we're particularly not super sensitive to that in this 4B channel. So then our limit is worse or higher than the other analyses. But for kappa 2B, the picture is completely flipped. Here we can see that across the entire spectrum, this blue line, the 4B line, is by far the lowest, so we're by far doing the best. And again, this is that same thing where if we change kappa 2B, give new physics here, we expect more energetic Higgs signal where we're the most sensitive. So that's why 4B really wins here. And I think it's really cool that this 4B analysis is really driving our sensitivity to this coupling, especially because it was thought to be previously a completely impossible analysis. So I think that's a pretty cool takeaway. But now I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about our prospects for the future, as well as how we can maybe be a bit smarter and boost our analysis. I want to quickly go back to the slide that I showed before of the timeline of the lifetime of the LHC. Again, everything I showed so far was from run 2. But in the future, we're going to start the so-called high luminosity or HLHC. We'll collide essentially more protons per unit time, and that'll allow us to collect a lot more data, about 20 times more than what we collected in run 2. And with more data, of course, means we expect a lot more of this rare Higgs pair signal. And so this means that we're expecting to be able to put even tighter constraints on new physics in our universe, or hopefully see some actual new physics in our universe, finally. So what's shown here is the same sort of our upper limit on the cross-section is a function of kappa 2B. But what's shown here is that result analysis that I just showed you, or the HH4B analysis I just showed you. But our projections of how the sensitivity would evolve if we use the full HLHC data set. So if we redo that analysis, but in 20 years with 20 times more data. And then because of course we have more signal, more sensitivity, our limits, our constraints are going to tighten now to an expectation of about 0.5 to 1.6. So we'll start being sensitive to about 50% or so effects in this coupling. And that's cool because this seems like it's maybe a little bit of a more realistic expectation from new physics than expecting something of, order 100% difference. So that's kind of hopeful. But there's also a question of could we do better even sooner? So I want to introduce something called the boosted topology. So let's imagine that I'm a Higgs boson and I'm in my own rest frame. When I decay to 2 b-quarks, they're going to go back to back. And that means that the b jets are also going to be back to back. However, if I'm going really fast in the detector frame, then as I go faster and faster, these b jets are going to get closer and closer together. And this is just a special relativity effect. And eventually, if my Higgs is really energetic, they're going to get so close that they merge into a single large radius jet. Basically a single object in our detector that we can no longer differentiate as two separate or result jets. And we call this the boosted topology. And it turns out that that's really interesting to think about in context of Higgs physics, because as I said, if we change this BVHH interaction, that kappa 2B, then we expect more energetic Higgs bosons. And so we would also expect to see more of this boosted signal. We also can take advantage again of another use of machine learning in order to make this an analysis taking advantage of this boosted topology possible. So we have dedicated algorithms in Atlas designed for tagging or identifying these specifically Higgs to BB bar decays in a large radius jet. What we do is we take that large radius jet and we reconstruct subjets. We actually do up to 3 if they're present. We pass those subjets into this B-tagging algorithm, the same one that I talked about earlier. We take the outputs from that algorithm, as well as some of the basic kinematic information of the large radius jet, and we pass that to a deep neural network that we call the XBB tagger. And that gives us, again, some sort of score or number that corresponds to how likely we think this jet is to have come from a Higgs to BB decay. And we can use that score to reject about 99% of our large radius jet background from mostly these QCD processes when we're trying to identify these Higgs to BB decays. So in Atlas, we more recently followed up in an analysis using exactly this boosted topology and this boosted tagging, this specifically boosted VBF Higgs pair to 4B analysis. So here, we're going to specifically target the VBF process because that's the one sensitive to BBHH different interactions. So what we're going to do now is search for two events with these two large radius jets that are XBB tagged. And we also can take advantage again of, you remember I mentioned that the VBF process specifically has these two sort of back-to-back extra jets from light quarks. Those you can see here, and we can take advantage of them in their kinematics. And with the selection in this analysis, we can get down to about 20 background events. And that is a huge improvement over the hundreds to thousands that we had for the result analysis. Unfortunately, you might notice we expect to only see about 0.02 of a standard model VBF Higgs to 4B event. So, okay, why bother? This is pretty bad. But that picture really quickly changes if we have new physics. So if we do have new physics, for example, let's go ahead and set kappa 2b equal to 0. We're going to turn off that VBHH interaction. And I want to emphasize that that wasn't basically the edge of the allowed region of new physics from the result analysis. In that scenario, we expect roughly 20 signal events in this topology. And that would give us a signal to background ratio of roughly 1. And that is, again, a huge improvement over the result analysis. This analysis, it turns out, is also just a lot easier. So we need some background estimation. And again, I'll note that we have the same backgrounds roughly, the mostly QCD multi-jet productions. We can't use simulation. We again need to rely on a data-driven approach. So we're going to again use these mass planes. In this case, it's a little bit simpler because we don't have any ambiguity between which jets came from which Higgs boson. Each Higgs boson makes one large radius jet. So the x-axis here is the mass of the sort of higher PT or higher transverse momentum large radius jet. And then the y-axis is the other large radius jet. We again expect to basically end up having our signal live in some region around 125, which is again denoted by this kind of weirdly triangular shaped signal region. We're again going to use this sort of a 2B and 4B like differentiation. So now our sort of quote unquote 2B equivalent for this analysis is where one of the two jets is tagged with the XBB tagger. We're going to call this the one pass region. But then our signal, of course, is expected to give us two XBB tag jets, and we're going to call this the two pass region. So our signal's living here. Now, you might notice that on the right-hand side where our signal is expected to live, there's pretty much no events there. And it turns out that we can't really use any fancy machine learning to try and do some fancy background estimation here. There's just not enough statistics to really learn anything. So instead, all we're going to do is just take the events in this one pass signal region and just directly use them to model those in the two pass signal region. Of course, there's a lot more events here than over on the right. So we do need some overall normalization factor correction. And all we're going to do is basically look at this green region, this outer donut that we call the CR or control region. And we're just going to take the ratio of the yield here over the yield here. So the two pass over the one pass. And that gives us some pretty small number. But again, that just gives us our simple normalization factor, and that's all we need. I'll note that we can also use the inner donut, the VR, in order to check this normalization factor and derive some uncertainties. So let's look at our observed data. Now, first I want to note that our x-axis here has changed. Now, instead of looking at the invariant mass of the di-Higgs system, I want to look at a boosted decision tree score, a BDT score. A BDT is just a simple classification algorithm. It's a simple use of machine learning. I'm going to feed it info and basically the jet kinematics, and then it'll spit out a number between 0, which is very background-like, and 1, which is very signal-like. So in black here is our observed data, and we can compare that to in yellow the expected backgrounds. Our backgrounds note are sort of peaked farther in the background-like region from our BDT, so that all is working as expected. And we do have very few events. I want to emphasize again, here we're looking at like 20 events instead of hundreds. But we do see that our agreement's pretty good. There's large statistical uncertainty, but overall pretty good agreement. So again, this does tell us that we don't see any obvious signs of new physics. And what those different types of di-Higgs signal would look like are again shown in these solid lines. So in pink is specifically the gluon-gluon fusion produced Higgs pair process in the standard model. And then in black is the standard model, but specifically the VBF di-Higgs process. And both of these are pretty rare in the standard model, so they're scaled up by pretty big factors. However, in blue, the light blue, this is the VBF di-Higgs process, specifically where we've set that kappa 2b equals to 0. And again, in this scenario, we expect in the order of about 20 signal events. And so this is not actually scaled at all. You can see that if we were to have that scenario of new physics in our rightmost bin, we would expect to see roughly 10 events compared to a background only expectation, also similar to the standard model expectation of 1 event. So we very, very strongly disfavor this level of new physics. So we can use this to constrain this VV-HH coupling, which is shown here. Now, again, in the x-axis, this is kappa 2b, and the y-axis, again, is basically the rate of this di-Higgs process. Now, there's a couple different lines here. The green that I'm showing here, this is the old resolved analysis that I showed a few slides ago. And in blue is the upper limit we get from the new boosted analysis. And note that down is better. The black solid line is the observed combination of both. So if we look near the standard model, we can see that the old resolved analysis is lower, so it's doing better than this new boosted analysis. This makes sense. In the standard model, we expect essentially no boosted signal. But if we have even a little bit of new physics, go just a little bit away from the standard model, this picture quickly changes, and you can see that our limit from the boosted analysis is doing much better. And if we look now at the combined allowed region of kappa 2b from these two analyses, that's about 0.5 to 1.5. So again, probing order 50% or so deviations to this coupling. And those numbers might seem a little familiar, because a few slides ago, I told you that the constraint of just this green, the resolved analysis, if we did that analysis with the full HL LHC data set, so if we did it with 20 times more data in 20 years, that would get us a constraint that's actually a little bit worse than what we have today with this new boosted analysis. And I think that is a really cool achievement. So I just want to wrap up by talking very quickly about one aspect in which we might be able to do even better in the future, which is reevaluating this boosted Higgs to BB bar tagging or with these large radius jets. I mentioned that this old XBB algorithm, it reconstructed these subjects in our large radius jet. But what really carries information in the presence of these b-quarks in a large radius jet is the tracking information and the presence of these little secondary or displaced vertices. So what we do now is we've recently come up with a new algorithm in Atlas where we take all of the tracks, as well as some of the large jet kinematics, and we feed this to a large transformer neural network that we're going to call the GN2X algorithm. And by transformer, this is essentially a special case of a graph neural network. And now that performance is shown here. So on the x-axis, this is the efficiency with which we identify the Higgs to BB bar signal. So we want that to be as close to 100% as possible. And in the y-axis is how much of our backgrounds we reject in the top panel. And particularly these dashed lines are what I want to focus on. This is the multi-jet rejection. So these QCD processes that are most of our backgrounds for the analyses I talked about today. So we want to reject as much of that as possible. So we basically want to be as far up and to the right as possible. We can compare the rejection from the GN2X tagger, this new algorithm in blue, versus in pink, the XBB tagger, the old one that we used for that boosted analysis. And we can see that we're gaining about a factor of 2 in background rejection for the same level of signal efficiency. And I want to also note that this is inspired, or this approach is inspired by a similar approach that's now being used for single B tagging in the resolved analysis. So we expect an improved resolved analysis in the future too. So keep an eye out. We'll do even better in the future with new B tagging. And now I just want to conclude. Measuring this Higgs pair process is really interesting because it probes Higgs pair production. or sorry, it probes the Higgs boson potential, and this could hold the key to some big questions in our universe, but it's really hard to measure. Machine learning is now enabling measurements in these so-called impossible channels like di-Higgs to 4b, and looking to the future, novel uses of machine learning, plus more data from the Run3 and eventually the Asia LHC, will open even more possibilities of Higgs boson studies in the future. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you to the DOE for funding, and also thank you to my group at Arizona.
Yeah, do you have any questions?
What defines the signal region? So you mentioned that it is kind of triangular. Is there some PT dependence on reconstructed mass of the peak?
Yeah. So a lot of it's frankly very ad hoc. I don't know if I have I don't think I have it here, but we kind of just tried to make the shape match with like what the Monte Carlo said that the distribution should look like. You do expect some asymmetry because you often have like a neutrino from a B hadron decay. And so but not always. So if you have two jets and one of them includes a neutrino, that's going to be the one that's softer. And so you're going to get more of a spread in like the sort of subleading jet axis than the leading jet axis. So that's why it's not like a perfect circle.
Okay, yeah.
Or perfect box.
I have a question. Are there other, I think it was kappa 2b values that, are beyond the standard model within the range that you could test that also expect high signal or like high enough signal to kind of redo the test with different values?
Let's see. So I'll note that we scan like a continuous range of kappa 2b, or a pretty continuous range. And there are, if I'm interpreting right, there is still some allowed region that we could still probe and do better before we really start to lose signal. So this boosted analysis could do a bit better because there's still a lot of space where we'd expect a little bit of boosted signal. And not so much background. And so basically like this space, I think we could still gain quite a bit pretty quickly. If that is what if I understood right.
Yes.
So there's interference between, the box diagram for GGF fusion and kappa lambda. Are you able to, or in these fits, do you constrain kappa T from single Higgs measurements, or do you keep them free floating?
So in these ones, we're keeping kappa T just fixed to 1. But we do have some other results, and most of these actually come from the combination.
Yeah.
So there was a single and di-Higgs combination, and here you can float kappa top as well. Yeah, because we don't really have a lot of sensitivity to kappa top, but like a TTH standard model analysis does. And so it's kind of more worth it to start doing like many of these floating constraints simultaneously if you have more analyses to actually constrain different regions.
Yeah.
So yeah, the sort of 20th, or sorry, not 20th, the sort of 10th anniversary of the Higgs boson, like the Nature paper there, like that combination includes some more of these different combination scenarios. Something's floating, something's not.
You mentioned that the kappa 2b comes from the BVHH interaction. There's this like Higgs loop in the middle. Couldn't you also have like a W loop or like a loop with another boson? And so then how do you differentiate that with like the 4 Higgs interaction?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You definitely can. How to say, we do have like standard model like WW scattering analyses though, and so you could at least constrain from that side. Whereas there's no sort of corresponding direct constraint on like the 4 Higgs interaction. Like we don't have like a Higgs Higgs to Higgs Higgs or something. But I mean, yeah, that's not really something we can do with the LHC, nor a direct like 1 Higgs to 3 Higgs. So it's kind of just that we don't have any other way of constraining that. So, but there are a lot of like W scattering measurements. So I think that would be okay. I will note that we actually don't have in any of the Monte Carlo available that actual loop diagram that I showed. And so you can't actually yet use this to extract a quartic coupling. But I did see an interesting result from a theory paper that claimed that you could extract, I think, basically an order of plus or minus 20 or so in the quartic coupling. From actually VHH at an E plus E minus collider. So it's the same interaction, or it's the same one loop correction to the same VVHH interaction. But of course, in a different scenarios, because it is an E plus E minus collider with a lot of data. So unclear how that would exactly translate to Atlas, but we can just constrain this much better than we can kappa lambda. I will note that in GGF, you can play the same game and you can actually have a quartic interaction or quartic contribution there at next loop level. That also hasn't been done, but there are people who are working on implementing that at least. So that one I think works outside of Atlas Monte Carlo, but not in the Atlas framework specifically for some reason. For the VBF, I don't even think this is available like in any of the existing like standard Monte Carlo packages, which I think is kind of a bummer because I tried to bother people to try and put this in because I thought it would be a fun actually undergraduate student project to see if they could make this work and get some replement on it. That would be pretty cool. But something we need to do.
Is it just really difficult to do in Monte Carlo? Is that why it doesn't exist, or is it just because it's rare?
I don't know. I think part of it, there just hasn't been a lot of interest, honestly. And I don't know the nuances of why it would be so hard. When I've asked, nobody's answered. We'll see if anyone maybe answers me at the Higgs Pairs workshop over the summer. Because I think there'll be like actual theorists that would like to ask.